Hey friends, I have been spending quite a bit of the last 4 years reading and teaching classes about and thinking about this book, right? Capital by Karl Marx. Uh, and as I was getting ready to do this episode, I got curious about exactly how long that's been. And I looked it up. The first capital class I taught started, I guess, about 3 years and was it like 9 months ago or something? So it was the uh, almost the end of March 2022. I was teaching it at Michael Albert's thing through Z Magazine, the School for Social and Cultural Change. I'd already taught a couple of classes for them on other subjects. And the most recent one I'd done before that capital class had been on this book, Karl Marx's Theory of History and Defense by patron saint of this show, G.A. Cohen. And teaching that one, I'd spent a lot of time thinking about some of what Cohen says about capital in this book. Right? So I thought, hey, let's actually do one about capital. I've never done that before. That sounds fun. So the School for Social and Cultural Change, they just did these like 8-week sessions, but I figured we could do part one of a capital class. And in that session that was starting at the end of March or almost the end of March, 2022, and do the first 8 chapters. And then we'll pick it up again for a part 2 class next session. But then SSCC went into hiatus. So we ended up just switching the class to the GTAA Patreon and kept it there until we'd gotten through the whole volume. It was just a volume 1 class. And then about a year after that class was done, we did a round 2 capital class on the GTA Patreon because I kind of realized that I missed it. I miss spending part of my Sundays talking capital in that way. And then midway through teaching that one, I ended up starting like a free in-person version of the class in Los Angeles, just because I thought it'd be fun to do it, in 3 dimensions. Never taught it that way before. And that one's actually still going. We've always been totally open door about new people joining whenever, by the way. So, if you're watching this and you live in LA and you want to come talk about capital with us, the class meets at 7 p.m. on Wednesdays at Cafe Mach in Koreatown. Tonight, right, we're going to be talking about Chapter 21 on peace wages and Chapter 22 on national differences in wages. Those are both like super short chapters. If you wanted to read them before you showed up to join up with class tonight. But in any case, probably after that, like next week, we're going to be doing chapter 23 on simple reproduction. And then we're going to be going on a break for a couple of weeks, since the next 2 Wednesdays after that are going to be Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve. But in January, we'll be right back at it with chapter 24. And we should have just like 4 sessions to go over the course of January and February, since, chapters 24 and 25, especially 25, that's a beast in terms of page count. Both deserve their own sessions, but I think we could do the last section of the book on primitive accumulation in 2 big sessions. And then, that'll be the end of my 3rd round through teaching it, which is, not a lot in the greater scheme of things, right? I mean, I think about somebody like David Harvey or whatever who's been at it for, decades and decades and decades. But, the point I'm making here is just that, that'll be the end of my 3rd time through teaching it. I've been spending a lot of time on this book in the last few years. I actually already started the 4th round because a few months ago on the GTA Patreon, after the last Zoom capital class there ended, I started a new one, or actually 2 new ones. We've got a volume 1 class on Saturdays, when the whole thing with that class is we're actually going through it super slowly this time, never more than 1 section a week. So most chapters are going to take multiple weeks. And then there's a normal speed volume 2 class on Sundays. And those are both still fairly early on because a lot's come up in the last few months that's gotten in the way of capital. Okay. All of which is to say, again, in the last few years, I went from thinking in early 2022, oh, maybe it'd be fun to teach a class on capital. I've never done that before. To somehow teaching 3 at once right now, the one in person and the one in person volume 1 class and the Zoom Patreon volume 1 class and the Zoom Patreon volume 2 class. For better or for worse, right, this thing has taken up a huge chunk of my life since the first one of those classes started. All of which maybe explains a little about how excited I was by this thing, right? When it came out, oh God, whatever this was at this point, a couple of years ago, I think, right? So this is the new Princeton translation. No, sorry, that's like a year and I think it was 2024. Doesn't matter, right? This is the new Princeton translation of Capital, and it's the first brand new translation into English since the Benjamin Fowkes translation, which is what this one, right, the Penguin uses, since that one came out in the 1970s, right? So it's a very big deal. If you look at the editorial board for the translation, which is listed like on a few pages in, right? You're going to see some huge names in contemporary Marxology on there. People like Michael Heinrich, best known for this book, How to Read Marx's Capital, and Kohei Saito, who actually, Saito's most relevant book is Marx and the Anthropocene, but I think I left my copy of that in storage space in LA. The last time I moved, so this is his most recent book, I think, Slow Down. And then there's an essay included at the end by William Clare Roberts, who wrote one of the most widely read books about capital in the last, decade or so, right? Certainly, which is Marx's Inferno. And there's an introduction by Wendy Brown, who's not exactly a Marxist, right? More on that in a minute, but who's certainly a giant name in sort of radical academic circles. So this thing came out, right? This Princeton edition, right? Came out to huge fanfare. In a review in the New York Times, for example, James Miller called it a tremendous achievement. In Open Letters Review, David Murphy called it marvelous. And even a lot of reviewers, not all of them to be fair, but a lot of reviewers, even who managed to restrain themselves from gushing quite as much as those two did, seemed to just sort of take it for granted that this just sort of obviously deserves to replace this as the standard English language edition of Capital. And for better or for worse, I do see some early signs they might be getting their wish. Like when I stop at the Barnes and Noble at like the Americana at Brand in LA, I don't see this, right? I just see this, right, being sold there. And look, I'm not going to bury the lead here. The apparent consensus, sorry, Andy's making me laugh. The apparent consensus about how marvelous and amazing this is, and what a tremendous achievement it is, and how, of course, it should be standard now, it all makes me feel like I'm going a little crazy because every time I dip into it, I hate this thing. I really hate it. And I'm going to spend today's episode trying to explain why and justify myself because I know I'm the odd man out here. But I really think that this thing, right, the Penguin edition is still the gold standard and everyone should read it. And I know some of this is going to make me sound a bit old man yells at skyish, right? Like I'm, Peter Hitchens bitching about the modernization of the Book of Common Prayer, but whatever. I'm prepared to own that. First, though, let's clarify something right up front about what I am not saying. Right? because otherwise there might be confusion about this. And, I don't want to give the wrong impression. I am not a German scholar or anything within a million miles of being a German scholar, and I have never pretended to be. When I teach capital classes, whatever value add I can bring to it as far as my academic background goes, and whatever sort of extra contribution I'm able to make as a result of that, is a matter of the sort of philosophy training about taking arguments apart and putting them back together again. And, I do think that can be useful. I think that could be like a helpful thing to add in going through Capital in terms of understanding the arguments that Marx makes in this book, and trying to do that in that analytical Marxism kind of way where you're not dogmatic about it, and all that, right? But I'm in no position to weigh in on micro level arguments about German word choices, right? So when I say that I think this thing is a really bad translation and a really bad edition, I'm not saying that it's a bad translation in the sense that I think it's an inaccurate translation. Now, I have seen some people criticize some of the choices that this book makes on those grounds, right? People who are German scholars will, of course, argue amongst themselves about that. And, whether like all of the choices about how to translate particular German words were the most accurate ways, or whether some other way would have been whatever, right? That's fine, right? I'm agnostic about those critiques. I'm just not in a position to weigh it. I did take 4 years of German way back when, but I know about enough German to order coffee or ask for directions or apologize that meine Grammatik ist sehr schlecht and my accent is probably worse. But that's about where I cap at, right? I mean, it's been a long time since the last German class I took, and I don't actively use it at all, right? So I sort of feel like I should be saying this in like a Michael Brooks, Barack Obama impression, but let me be clear. Let me be clear. I'm not criticizing the Princeton translation on the grounds that I think that it's an inaccurate translation from the German. But I also don't accept that therefore I cannot have an opinion about this thing at all, right? That the only people who get to weigh in on this are German scholars. Because look, one way of criticizing a translation is to say that you think it's inaccurate, but that's not the only way. It's not even close to being the only way. That's not how any of this works, right? Like, there's a reason why there are lots of people who are fluent in Russian and fluent in English and know how to read and write who wouldn't be able to write a good translation of Anna Karenina. And there are God knows how many people who speak both languages well who would do a shitty job of translating Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations from English to Russian. One way of judging a translation of any book is to say, is this accurate? That's like the most minimal standard. That's the most basic baseline there could be. But another way that everyone judges every translation of every book is this good as a work of literature in the new language? And don't get me wrong, if you're like translating a Dan Brown novel into Russian, I don't think the like Russian Da Vinci Code is going to be great literature, right? Or I don't think you've like failed as a translator if the Russian Da Vinci Code isn't great literature, since there's only so much a translator can do. But if you're translating Anna Karenina from Russian to English and the result is a piece of shitty English prose, then you've done a bad job as a translator because you did have something to work with. Just saying, oh, well, if you aren't a Russian scholar, you can't criticize the accuracy of the translation because, you can't fight with me about individual word choices. So therefore you can't make any sort of criticism of my plotting unreadable translation of Anna Karenina. Well, anybody who said that, I think we would all recognize that that would be a pretty silly thing to say. A good translation of a piece of good literature from another language needs to be accurate, yes, but it should also be a piece of good literature in the new language. And yes, these two imperatives can sometimes be in tension with each other. Sometimes they're trade-offs, right? Between the two standards. But any good translation should at least score pretty highly on both counts. I mean, that's a fair standard. That's a standard nobody would fight me about in any other context. And besides accuracy and literary quality, which are, again, both ways that we would normally judge the translation of any book, when we're talking specifically about Capital, and I almost said a book like Capital, but honestly, Capital is pretty unique, right? They sort of, in terms of the kind of combination of things it is, right? If you read this thing just as like, in terms of the combination of the sort of abstract economic analysis and historical narrative, and the way he's like fighting with these, this like cast of characters of political economists, who's taking these like very witty shots out over the course of the book and all that. You really do kind of have to put that in a category by itself, right? So if you're talking specifically about this book or any book that's very much like it, it's also fair to judge a translation as well as accuracy and literary quality as like a political and theoretical intervention. So before you leave a comment on this episode saying, how are you going to criticize a translation without talking about the German word choices? First, tell me what you disagree with about what I just laid out in the last few minutes. I think we can have a smarter conversation than that. Okay. So if I'm not criticizing this on the basis of me saying it's inaccurate, then what's the problem? Huh? What's my issue with it? Basically, I have, broadly speaking, 3 different criticisms of this thing. And all of these are going to be comparative, because I'm not just shitting on the Princeton translation, though I'm not going to lie. I'm absolutely doing that. But I'm trying to make the case that if you want to read Capital, which is something I really encourage everybody to do, you shouldn't read this, right? You should read this, right? You should read the Penguin edition, because I think it's better than this on all 3 of these counts. Okay, so these are the sort of 3 big things that I want to say here. First, I think that the choice of which German edition of Capital to translate doesn't make any sense to me at all, right? Especially if people want to make this the new standard English language Capital. Second, I think that the supplemental material in this is just much worse than the supplemental material in this, right? I mean, the extra stuff besides Marx's text in this is better than the extra stuff in Marx's text in this, which I know a lot of people are going to think is crazy who are familiar with both, because there's so much more in this, right? There's so much more. There's so much extra, scholarly apparatus. People say this. Isn't this obviously better? I don't think so. And then finally, and I will admit that on a visceral level, this is what bugs me the most. I think that on a prose level, right, this thing is kind of an abomination, right? Like, just as a writer, never mind as the most insightful critic of capitalism in the system's history, who wrote a massively important book that I want everybody to read, but just like as a writer, I think Marx deserves better than this. Okay, so let's start at the top, right, with the first criticism. So this thing is a translation of the second German edition of Capital, but that's not the last edition that even came out in Marx's lifetime. There was a French edition after the second German edition that Marx was very involved in, spent years, there was a initial French translator, but he spent years going through the manuscript and getting everything exactly to his liking. And, personally signed off on every sentence before it was published. And then, yeah, Marx died before the third German edition could come out, but he made a point of asking Engels to incorporate a bunch of changes that he'd made in the French edition for the next German edition. Like, that's non-dispute, right? Everybody recognizes that he did that, right? So, like, if this were just like a scholarly curiosity, right, that something super specialists could find in academic libraries, I could see the value in having the second German edition in English just for like academics whose German was rusty, but who wanted to compare, you know, how this version was to the changes that Marx made later or whatever. Sure, fair enough. But if this is supposed to be the new like standard English language capital, sorry, it's really strange to me that they're translating an edition that leaves out a bunch of changes that Marx made during the last edition he worked on, right, the French edition, and that he then asked his best friend Engels to incorporate into the next edition after that. It just seems pretty obviously less true to Marx's intentions than this thing, which translates the fourth German edition, right? So it's the up-to-date as far as the Engels part. And by the way, right, William Clare Roberts, who I've disagreed with about plenty of subjects in the last year, you can read the stuff I've written about him, but, you know, credit where credit is due, you know, he makes the case that they should have just translated the French edition too, and I think he makes it very well. So the Princeton editors, so that's Paul Ryder and Paul North, include a 4-page on the choice of edition note at the beginning, and they make what just seems to be like a really weird case for going with the second German edition, right? So the crux of their argument comes right at the second sentence of the note, right? They say the second edition of 1872 was the last authorized text of Volume 1 published in the original German, in the sense that it was the last one that Marx himself revised and approved for publication. And okay, that's true, but why does it matter that that was the last one published in German that Marx approved for publication? I mean, even if you don't trust Engels, right? Like, you don't trust the way that Engels implemented the changes Marx asked him to make for the third edition. And to lay my own cards on the table, I do, right? I trust the judgment of Marx's lifelong best friend and close intellectual collaborator a lot more than I trust the judgment of most 21st century, Marx scholars. But even if you don't trust Engels, whatever, the French edition exists. So why not just translate that? And in the next paragraph, they write, Marx's work on the Capital Project is like a river that flows for 20 years and more, a river of research, plans, drafts, and revisions, not to mention complete restarts and rewritings. Any section lifted out of this flow is at once fascinating and false. You can't step into the same river twice, and in Marx's case, not even once. And I know some people love this kind of writing, but I'm not one of them. Like, let's take that last part seriously, maybe more seriously than any reader who's nodding along with this passage is going to take it. You can't step into the same river twice, and in Marx's case, not even once. Well, why not even once for Marx? What does it mean to say that you can't step in once in Marx's case? Taken seriously, this sounds like it means that you can't sit down and read an individual draft or edition and understand what it means. I'm pretty sure Ryder and North don't literally think that that's true, but if they don't mean that, what do they mean that you can't step in even once? What? Picking up there, they say revision was his continuous practice. With each set of revisions, earlier thoughts, even if they remain intact, look different in light of new conceptualizations, as well as material on government policy and laws, worker organizing, and technological change that he was constantly gathering. That is to say, anyone who claims that a particular pile of pages in this ongoing flow is the definitive version is misleading you or has been misled. Okay. But if that's true, then it sounds like that would mean all choices of which edition to translate would be equally good or equally bad. Presumably, though, Ryder and North didn't put all the different editions on a dartboard, to decide which one to translate, right? Blindfold themselves and, throw a dart. They had reasons to make the specific decision they made. So all this belaboring of the point that no decision could be absolutely perfect is fine, sure, but it's completely irrelevant to what they're trying to do with this note, which is to justify their particular decision. Next, there's a long paragraph about all the other stuff Marx wrote during those years, the Grundrisse, for example, where he works out the arguments that eventually made it into Capital. But of course, that's completely off topic as far as like which edition of Capital it's best to translate. After that, they start talking about all the notes for revisions he made for the second edition, which were concretized in the second edition, right? So these are the notes he made for revision after the first edition, which they say were concretized in the second edition. And okay, fair enough. If that were the end of the story, then translated the second edition would make sense, right? Marx, publishes the first edition, then a bunch of new stuff occurs to him. He makes a bunch of notes for revisions, and then he implements it, concretizes it in the second edition, and then calls it a day and goes out for a beer. But they acknowledge that's not the case, right? Marx just kept making notes for further revisions after the second edition. So if the point of translating the second German edition is that it concretizes the changes, and good Lord, by the way, I just kind of hate this kind of writing, right? What, like, concretize? Okay, whatever. Concretizes the changes that he made, and that he was indicated in those notes for revisions, right? If that's the justification for translating the second German edition, that concretizes the changes Marx came up with in his notes after the first one, then by the same reasoning, why wouldn't it have been better to translate either the French edition, which again Marx signed off on every detail of, right, after years of working through it, or else the later German editions, in which Engels carried over many of those changes from the French as requested by Marx, and also concretized even more changes that Marx had asked him to make. Now, they do, to be fair, bring up the option of the French edition, so let's check out their argument against that. So they say, what often goes unaddressed in discussions of Le Capital. I don't know if that's how I pronounce that. I just like saying it that way. The first French translation is that the text is a kind of philological black box. Since the manuscript that Marx reworked has been lost, it is for the most part impossible to know where Marx revised the formulations he was given or replaced them with his own renderings from the German, and where he merely signed off on the translator Joseph Roy's efforts. We also don't have the German source text that Roy and Marx used when they produced their translation. Although it is unlikely that Roy and Marx started working with the first edition, or though it is likely, that Roy and Marx started working with the first edition and at some point switched to the second once it appeared. It is therefore mostly impossible to know where the French translation renders the first edition, the published version of the second German edition, or a text revised beyond that. Okay, but why does that matter? We know that Marx went back and forth with Roy, the French translator, very extensively until everything was exactly to his liking and he signed off on it all. So given that, what does it matter whether Marx himself came up with the idea for any given change, or Joseph Roy suggested it and Marx said, oh yeah, good idea, we'll do that? And why does it matter what in German they were working with to produce the French edition if they both approved of the French result? Right? I mean, that just kind of doesn't, that's sort of a non sequitur. Things get even more confusing when they shrug off the many notes that Marx gave Engels for further revision. Right? So here's how they justify that. The instructions that Marx left him, right, Engels, the instructions that Marx left him posed many challenges. Marx did not say which changes mattered most, what principle to follow when integrating them into the text, or how to decide which ones should actually stay. For that matter, he didn't say, in fact, he couldn't have said, which historical events might already have proven some of these changes superfluous or wrong by the time of his editing. But there are other challenges. But there are other considerations. For example, how to translate back into German the passages from the French translations that Marx wanted to see inserted into future German editions. There is no way of knowing if he would have agreed with the translations that others produced. We could say that Marx's experience with the French translation suggests that he would have raised objections. He spent 3 years revising the original translator's work. And by the way, let's just pause to note that they've just told us that Marx spent 3 years revising the French edition, which really goes to the point that he approved every change that was made to that edition, which makes it feel a little crazy to me for them to instead translate an edition from before all of Marx's changes to the French edition. But whatever. The paragraph I read is their big argument that it's okay to leave out all of the changes that Marx asked Engels to make in the third edition. And just to make sure you don't think I'm leaving anything out, that there's some part of their argument for using the second German edition that I'm ignoring, here's what they say at the end of the paragraph before that one about why the second German edition is good enough after all, right? Even though, the river is always flowing and you can't step in it once or whatever, right? They write, many changes occurred to him, right, Marx, after the second edition. It is true. But despite a few loud voices saying that this or that change holds the key to the whole operation, the fundaments don't change fundamentally, right? The fundaments don't change fundamentally. And in truth, there is no way to establish which of the changes that Marx clearly indicated for a third German edition would have remained important and which he would have jettisoned had he had the time and will to sit down and insert them. The fact that he didn't even start work on a third edition himself can't be read as definitive either, although it could suggest that since he decided to do other work in the remaining years of his life amidst worsening illness, instead of more revisions to Volume 1, he had conceded to himself the second edition was a good enough statement on the capitalist production process. But when you take all that and the passage that I just read before that, right, which is the next paragraph together, and try to see, okay, what's Ryder and North's argument here? I just find it amazing how little of an argument there actually is. Like, okay, let's review everything we just heard them say in those two passages about why it's fine to leave out every single one of the changes that Marx made after the second German edition. The strongest point they make, which they admit, okay, give me 1 second. Let me just... All right, sorry about that. So the strongest point they make, which they admit is not very strong, is that Marx hadn't gotten around to starting work on the third German edition, right? He had too much else to do and he was sick. So he must not have thought the changes were that urgent. But other than that point, which again, they themselves say you can't read too much into, what are they giving us here? Basically, that we can't be certain of what Marx would have thought about how Engels implemented those requests. And second, that the fundaments of Marx's argument in Capital don't change fundamentally due to the changes that Marx requested after the second German edition. Now, the first point is certainly true, like trivially. If somebody asked for a change but died before they could see it implemented, we can't be absolutely certain about what they would have thought about the implementation. But I gotta say, that just seems like a really weak sauce to me. And again, if for whatever reason you don't trust Engels' execution of Marx's revision requests for the later German editions, I actually think you should. But if you don't, okay, the French edition exists. And pretty clearly, the point about fundaments, right? The fundaments didn't change fundamentally, cuts equally well in every direction. By and large, the fundaments are the same even in the first German edition. And they're the same in the fourth German edition from Engels, right? So if you read this thing, by the way, right, the Penguin, whenever Engels actually inserts new words to try to carry out one of Marx's requests, it's clearly indicated in the text with little notes saying like, oh, the part, starting in the brackets here or whatever is all Engels until this part. Right? So it's not like somebody reading would be confused about which sentences were which. So if the second German edition is good enough because the fundaments haven't, don't fundamentally change later, any edition is good enough because the fundaments are the same. As an argument for their choice of edition, this is kind of not an argument at all. But hey, maybe this part isn't all that important because truly, by and large, you're getting most of the same words and most of the same order in any of the German or French editions, right? So the biggest effect of the choice of which edition to translate that you're going to notice as you go through it is that it, messes up the chapter order. Since Marx changed that starting the French edition, which is certainly annoying if you're teaching a class or participating in a reading group where different people are reading different editions, but fundamentally it's not that big a deal. So hell with it, right? Let's move on to the second criticism, which is all the extra material in here in the Princeton seems way worse to me than the extra material in here, right? In the Penguin. Let's start with the biggest, most obvious difference, right? The introduction to the Penguin edition was written by Ernest Mandel, who's one of the most important Marxist thinkers of the late 20th century, and was personally involved in like a real world socialist political project. Not, my version of that project exactly. Basically, he was the most important Trotskyist after the death of Trotsky, but I have tons of respect for Mandel. He's a very clear writer and often an insightful one. And he spent decades of his life thinking carefully about Marxist economics. And he was doing all this from, again, a deeply politically engaged perspective as the leading thinker of a political organization, the First International, that was actually trying to do things in the real world. Contrast that to Wendy Brown. And I want to be clear that I'm not even hating on Wendy Brown here. I think she's an interesting thinker who actually does have some valuable insights, right? Like, I think that there's some meaningful overlap between some of the points that I was making in Monday's episode about the left's pathologies of powerlessness and some of what Brown wrote about the effects of neoliberalism and stunting everybody's political horizons and kind of turning people towards these sort of more inward facing, critiques and, all that stuff. But ultimately, what Wendy Brown is like a vaguely radical academic and not one who's particularly immersed in thinking about Marxism. She writes from an eclectic, combination of influences, and Marxism is certainly somewhere in that mix. But I'm not making like a purist point here. Like, no one is allowed to be influenced by anything but Marxism. I'm just saying that Brown has spent her career less focused on Marx and Marxism than Ernest Mandel was, right? Which again is not a character flaw, but it is relevant to like which one of them is going to write a better introduction to Capital. And I do think the difference in like how much time each of them had spent thinking about Marx and Marxism does show in those two introductions. And I also, well, okay. So Matt Huber had a good Twitter thread on this. I didn't see it until he shared it with me after his Substack essay came out, but I think he put it. I think he put some of this perfectly there. I'll link to it in the description for this episode. Huber is a bit more generous than I'm being right now, but in that Twitter thread, he says, "quote Overall, I think the front matter in this edition, right, the Princeton, is very much inferior to Mandel's intro from 1976. The former, clearly written by academics seeking deep-sounding, clever turns of phrase, the latter by a committed member of an international Marxist organization." And that bit about deep-sounding, clever turns of phrase did, I've got to say, describe my reaction to a lot of the stuff at the front of the Princeton, both by Brown and by Ryder and North. Huber also points out a really jaw-dropping line from Paul North's intro, where he says, nowhere really does Marx condemn the capital system or call for revolution. And by the way, the capital system strikes me as a really annoying affectation. It is true that Marx never uses the word, Kapitalismus, right? Capitalism in German, but he does use, a lot of phrases like, bourgeois society, or the capitalist mode of production. And I think instead of calling it capitalism, calling it the capital system just feels, I don't know, sort of hipsterish. Like the point is just to show off your knowledge that he didn't use that one particular word rather than to actually clarify anything. But that's not my main objection to this passage, right? Forget that. Let's just start from the top. Right? Say, nowhere really does Marx condemn the capital system or call for revolution. That would be futile, maybe even silly. The system was taking over the world. And you would play right into its personifying gesture. It's personifying gesture. To judge it as if it were a thinking, willing agent, like a sovereign state that could be countered with force. It is not one. It is an aggregate of actors and processes that work together despite the contingency of any particular deal, always work out in favor of the system. And no, I'm sorry, but no, the system not being a particular individual person like a king or, a particular state, right, doesn't mean it can't be ended and overcome by expropriating the capitalists and transitioning into a new system, right, based on collective ownership and workplace democracy. And in fact, in the next sentence, North has to awkwardly acknowledge that in the, in the next to last chapter of the book, and, certainly in the this chapter order, does famously culminate with Marx looking ahead to the future expropriation of the expropriators and the transition to socialism, right? So it does, in fact, not in this condemnation of capitalism, all over this thing, right? But it does, in fact, have a call for revolution at the end. So let's see how North tries to shoehorn that in, right? He writes, at only one point in the book does Marx recall his earlier revolutionary anger and evoke a future where capitalists who expropriated land and labor get paid back in kind. The expropriators will be, he says, expropriated by a liberated and educated mass of workers. See chapter 24, well, chapter 32, right? But the chapter order is all messed up in this edition because the translation choice, the choice of edition. So despite this remnant of a manifesto, this cry for a future in which the whole system will have been overturned and turned into something better for everyone, the overwhelming mood of the book is ambivalence, another kind of double. Ambivalence is the double attitude Marx adopts toward the behemoth, which had become, in his mind, a largely immovable fact. And again, what on earth are you talking about? Absolute bullshit. Capital was so carefully and lovingly crafted, right? This is Marx's masterpiece. Marx knows exactly what he's doing with the ending, right? The revolutionary conclusion about expropriating the expropriators at the end of chapter 32, with the last short chapter, chapter 33, essentially acting as an epilogue, sort of reinforcing the point by talking about the colonies and basically arguing that there's no escaping from the class struggle in the home country, and thus from the need to expropriate the expropriators. There's no escaping from that by moving the colonies to homestead. That possibility is being closed off everywhere already. So it'll be class struggle here, class struggle there. But that revolutionary conclusion of chapter 32 was very carefully and lovingly built up to. North trying to brush it off as if, oh yeah, Marx has this one little slip, right? As if, Marx was having a little 1848 flashback and like accidentally jotted it down, in the text without realizing that he was writing as he was thinking about it. It's like stream of consciousness or something. Is just, I think about the nicest thing you can say about this is it's a pretty strange suggestion. Let's maybe leave it there and then move on to the last part of the extra stuff in this new edition that we haven't talked about yet, which is the endnotes. Everybody praises the endnotes, the quote, extensive scholarly apparatus, unquote. And it is true that there's way more words spent in translator notes here, right, in the Princeton than here in the Penguin. But also, honestly, I think sometimes less is more. Right? So, for example, right at the outset of chapter 1, right, we have Marx talking about commodities having both use values and exchange values. And Marx says that every commodity has a use value insofar as it directly or indirectly meets some human need. And this leads to a long endnote, which let's just take a look. All right. Throughout, the German word unmittelbar is translated with the idiomatic American English indirect or indirectly. It should be kept in mind that Marx refers here to one half of a pair of modes crucial to Hegel's philosophy. Unmittelbar and mittelbar, immediate or unmediated, and mediate or mediated. Unmittelbar refers to the unmediated, first blush, unreflected, simple appearance of something which later on in the analysis always turns out to be made of a much more complex relation. An unmediated appearance is revealed to depend altogether for its character on another thing, and so in fact is mediated by that thing. Money is the unmediated direct appearance of value, but of course, as we learn, what allows money to represent value is that it is in constant communication with workers, producers, commodities, exchange, circulation, imperialism, and so on. In short, the unmediated form of something temporarily disguises the thing's position in the multiform process, the process of processes, the global system, regardless of how well or violently it works. All right. End of paragraph. Again, this is all inspired by Marx using the phrase directly or indirectly. And by the way, right there in the text, when he uses those words directly and indirectly, he clarifies exactly what he means by directly or indirectly. Directly, quote, as a means of subsistence or enjoyment, unquote, or indirectly, quote, as a means of producing something else, unquote. That seems, I have to say, pretty damn self-explanatory to me. Do we really need Hegel and imperialism and processes that are made out of other processes and the rest of that stuff that I just read off in that exhausting paragraph to understand the contrast between direct and indirect? Do we really? Right? Does this whole paragraph that I just read out add literally anything to anyone's understanding of the thought that Marx is expressing when he says that the use value of a commodity can either be directly useful to someone personally consuming it or indirectly useful to someone using it to make something else? Is there anything in the directly, indirectly contrast, as Marx himself draws it, that actually cries out for further explication? I have to say, I don't think so. And by the way, when I said this in my Substack essay, there's this Twitter account, Left Nietzschean. I think that's the guy who wrote a book about Marx and Nietzsche called Philosophizing with a Hammer and Sickle. And my saying what I just said just now, right? I said the same thing in my essay, and that got him to go off about how I must be saying that no one needs to read Hegel, and philosophy doesn't matter, and working class people are too dumb to understand Hegel, or blah, 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 blah. It's like, my friend, you need to relax. I'm not saying any of that. I'm pro reading Hegel, right? This book I mentioned earlier, right? Karl Marx's Theory of History, A Defense. Right? One of my all-time favorite books about Marx. Starts out with an interesting chapter about Hegel's theory of history to sort of set up the contrast to Marx's theory of history. And Marx, in that chapter, right, Cohen does a surprisingly sympathetic deep dive and reconstruction. And I really love that chapter, right? I'm not saying that no one should read Hegel. I'm sure as fuck not saying that working class people are too dumb to read Hegel. And by the way, the Left Nietzschean guy's first clue that I probably wasn't saying that should have been that he was reading this essay in a Substack that's literally called Philosophy for the People. I am, for God's sake, obviously in favor of making philosophy accessible to everybody, right? I don't think anybody's too dumb for this. What I am saying is that I absolutely do not think that any reader, whether they're a philosophy professor, an assembly line worker, student living on the street, anyone else, I don't think anyone needs that whole long paragraph about Hegel and imperialism and processes made out of other processes to understand what Marx means when he says that commodities have use values insofar as they meet human needs, either directly as a means of subsistence or enjoyment, or indirectly as a means to produce something else. I don't think anyone's understanding is enriched by that. I think it's just pointless performative showing off. And what I read you was just the first 169 words of that endnote. It keeps going for another 269 words after that. And I suppose if you're super duper curious about what the various German words being translated to English as either object or thing are, or you're dying to know Northern writers' thoughts about how Marx might have understood the distinction between subsistence and enjoyment in the phrase means of subsistence or enjoyment, I guess you should check out that second paragraph, but I don't think I have it in me to go through the rest of that endnote. So let's move on to a way more in-depth endnote than that one, though I promise this will be the end of the Princeton endnotes after that. In section 1.3, Marx says that commodities have both useful qualities and economic values. So at this point, he's not talking about use value or exchange value, right? Like, not talking about the way that the commodities can, meet human needs or what you can, get for them in exchange, but he's talking about this third thing, just value, right? That he thinks explains the exchange value ratios, and he analyzes it in terms of the amount of labor that it takes to produce the commodity, and there are a bunch of more bells and whistles there, but it's a theory based on the labor that it takes to produce it ultimately. So Marx saying that commodities have both concrete useful qualities and also economic values leads to note XXVIII. It's only 1.3. We're already at translator note XXVIII, which is longer than a lot of articles I've written for Jacobin. The first few lines of the endnote are, I think, intended as an explication of what Marx means by value, but judge for yourself. Here's what they say. Value is a teletechnology. A teletechnology. Value is a teletechnology that allows one thing to be exchanged for a qualitatively different thing at a distance of time and space without significant loss. In the Capital project, value is the main object of study. No, it's not, by the way. The main object of study in Capital is capitalism as a class structure. The value stuff is secondary to that main point. Marx is talking about value insofar as he's using that to frame insights about the class structure. But look, I'll admit I'm making a controversial judgment there. Smart people can and do disagree with me. So we can put that debate aside and just read this endnote. Right? We just heard, remember, that value is a teletechnology that allows one thing to be exchanged for a qualitatively different thing at a distance of time and space without significant loss. Now we find out that although a technology, it isn't purely or even primarily physical, even if it often counts on physical bearers like commodities or coins or concrete labor. Value is as much an idea as a thing, as much a phantasm in the mind as a practical commitment by everyone involved, as much a general feature of the system as an individual quasi-immaterial substance actually existing and realized in purchase, sale, or trade. It goes on and on and on and on and on and on from here. Again, many Jacobin articles shorter than this endnote. But just take what I just read out. If you didn't know what Marx meant by value before you started this endnote, and you tell me, right, you look me in the eye and tell me that you now know what Marx means by value because you read that endnote, I'm sorry, but you're lying to me. I would be genuinely fascinated to see somebody try to extract an actual clear definition of value from what I just read. I'd actually be really impressed if you could. Like, give me a sentence that starts with, when Marx says value, he means, and then ends with something that's both one, a clear definition, and two, something you actually extracted from those lines I just read. Come on. Right? In G.A. Cohen's more feisty and polemical moments, he, really just one is the introduction of the 2000 edition of this book, as far as I know. It's the only place I can think of where he says it in print. But in Cohen's more feisty and polemical moments, he refers to analytical Marxism as no bullshit Marxism. And sometimes that feels a little harsh to me, right? Personally, I feel like there's plenty of post-Marx Marxist writing in other modes besides the analytical one that I certainly wouldn't condemn as bullshit. But man, this is one of the moments where I feel like, yeah, right, that's about right. And this right here, that passage about value from the endnotes that I just read out, this is one of the moments where I feel like, yep, this is why we need analytical Marxism. Like, if analytical Marxism is no bullshit Marxism, this endnote, that's the other kind of Marxism. All right. So we've been over why the choice of edition makes no sense to me, and why Ryder and North's argument for choosing to translate that edition doesn't really add up. We've been over why all the extra material in here is way worse than the extra material in the Penguin edition. But I admitted earlier that none of that is really what bothers me the most about this thing. What really bothers me, honestly, what the risk of sounding too precious about this, what kind of offends me is that Capital isn't just the most insightful book ever written about the economic system that still dominates all of our lives, although, it certainly is that. It's also a totally one-of-a-kind literary masterpiece. It's like one of the best pieces of nonfiction writing to come out of the 19th century. And it honestly kind of offends me, like, what this does to Capital as a work of literature. Right? So to see what I mean, let's start right at the beginning. Right? Chapter 1, Section 1. All right. So this is the second paragraph. In Penguin, in other words, in the Fowkes translation, this is the commodity, first of all, is an external object, a thing which, through its qualities, satisfies human needs of whatever kind. The nature of these needs, whether they arise, for example, from the stomach or the imagination, makes no difference. Got it? In the Princeton edition, this becomes A commodity is, first of all, an external object, a thing whose properties satisfy human wants or needs of whatever kind. The nature of these wants and needs, whether they come from our belly or our imagination, doesn't matter here. Just why? It's not like in the Fouts we're somehow unclear about the fact that Marx is using the word needs in a broad enough way to include subjective wants. Right? That becomes very beautifully and elegantly clear in the next sentence when he says it doesn't matter whether the needs arise from the stomach or the imagination. There's absolutely no nuance of meaning that's captured here that you lose in the Fouts. None. They've just ruined the poetry of the paragraph for no good reason whatsoever. 2 paragraphs later, in the Fouts, we have the usefulness of a thing makes it a use value. But this usefulness does not dangle in midair. It is conditioned by the physical properties of the commodity and has no existence apart from the latter. In Princeton, that nice, crisp, does not dangle in midair from the Fouts is pointlessly changed to doesn't, right? Contraction, doesn't hover above us in the air. Like an undergrad trying to cover up pre-chat GPT plagiarism by changing a bunch of random words and phrases from whatever they're plagiarizing from into synonyms. I'm not saying that did anything like that. I'm just saying that's how it reads, right? That's the quality of prose here. Just why, right? You can't excuse it by claiming that it's a more accurate translation because the actual meaning being expressed by the 2 sentences that I just read from the Fouts could equally be expressed by the 2 sentences I just read for the Princeton, vice versa, right? There's the propositions being expressed by these sentences are identical. There is zero difference in meaning between in either of those 2 passages I just read, either the Penguin version or the Princeton version. It's not just that they're both well within a range of acceptable translations, given the sort of latitude that we'd normally give translators to sort of work with whatever they've got in the original and turn it into something that's readable in the new language. It's not just they're both within that broad range, right? It's that they're both within a ridiculously tiny radius of that range. Identical meanings. The Princeton just makes the prose slightly shittier to be different. In between those 2 examples, we have Fouts translated Marx as saying that discovering the manifold uses of different objects is the work of history. The Princeton translation makes that is a historical act. And there's just no sense in which readers would have a different understanding of the idea that Marx is trying to get across, depending on whether they read is the work of history or is a historical act. But again, it really seems like the rhythm of the sentence has just gotten a little bit shittier. And again, just why? And there are a lot of other examples I could give here. Like there's a famous passage in the preface to the first edition where Marx is basically saying the point of this book is to analyze capitalism, right? Its internal dynamics, how it came to be, and why it'll eventually be, overcome by the working class, rather than to construct a vision of exactly what should replace it. Right? It's a passage I've thought about a lot over the years since the book that Bhaskar and Mike Beggs and I wrote for Verso that we just finished and it's coming out next fall, right? The blueprint. How socialism can work in the real world, right? Plug, is doing the exact thing Marx is saying in that passage not to bother to do, right? So I've spent a lot of time thinking about, why he said that and what he means and all of that stuff, right? And in Fouts, the translation of that passage is Marx saying he doesn't want to write recipes for the cook shops of the future, right? Very famous, iconic phrase, right? He's not going to write recipes for the cook shops of the future by telling us, exactly what should come after capitalism. And the Princeton, I swear to God, I'm not making this up, turns recipes for the cook shops of the future into recipes for the eateries of the future, which again, just good Lord, why? But I'll just wrap up with probably the single example that made me the most sad. In chapter 7, Marx is talking, sorry, let me find this. Yep. Here we go. Right. So chapter 7, Marx is talking about the difference between things that are true just because of how material production of goods would have to work in any society versus things that are historically specific to the class structure he's analyzing in the book, which is, of course, capitalism, right? It's between material facts and social facts. Cohen has a nice extensive discussion that year. And sort of meditating on this point leads him to one of the best rhetorical flourishes in this whole thing, right? One of the best passages in Capital, right? Marx writes, the taste of porridge does not tell us who grew the oats, and the process we have presented does not reveal the conditions under which it takes place. Whether it is happening under the slave owner's brutal lash or the anxious eye of the capitalist, whether Cincinnatus, right, the Roman statesman who famously retired to his farm, right, whether Cincinnatus undertakes it in tilling his couple of acres, or a savage when he lays low a wild beast with a stone. All right. That's good, right? And good Lord, what these people have done to that passage in the Princeton. Let's find where they give it to us here. All right, so in the new chapter order, this is now chapter 5 instead of 7. So starts. There we go. All right. So if you remember what I just read, this is what the Princeton turns it into. But, right, the sentence now starts with the word but, right? But how wheat tastes doesn't tell us who grew it. And looking at the labor process in this way tells us just as little about the actual conditions in which it is carried out. Whether it runs its course under the slave overseer's brutal whip or the capitalist's watchful eye. Whether it is Cincinnatus who completes a labor process by tilling his couple of hugera, or a savage who does that by slaying wild beasts with a stone. I'm sorry, but there's just no excuse for that. I'll just wrap up here with the last few paragraphs from the Substack essay that I wrote about this. Here, let me just do a quick screen share. Oh, Jew. Right. So last few paragraphs of here, right? What I said is Karl Marx was one of the greatest nonfiction literary stylists who ever lived. He doesn't deserve to have his writing given to us in a form that mindlessly insists on attentions to details that don't matter. If Marx used a relatively informal German word, an equally informal English word must be used. If Marx used a German neologism, an English neologism must be used, and so on. It doesn't convey any of the greatness of his writing. More importantly, Capital is worth reading for its core insights, but it sits unread on far too many bookshelves. Readers with the stamina to get through the often obscure initial chapters deserve an edition that will get them excited about what they're reading and propel them to the end of the book. On both counts, the Princeton edition is a massive step backwards. All right. Having gotten all that out my chest, give me a minute to take a look at the chat. I haven't really been watching it for a little while now. Let's see. Man, I can't believe Tony Red's not in this chat. Maybe he'll check it out later. Hi, Tony, when you do. Andy says, I think they should hire Ben to read the Penguin edition for an audiobook and keep his rants about the bad writing. I would take that gig. Let's see. He also offers to do it himself in a German accent, though he says, if I did that by the end of the book, unless I have a good director, my accent gets so strong I'm borderline incomprehensible. Thank you, Drea. Drea says this is why everyone should take Ben's Capital Volume 1 or 2 class. Yeah, well, if you've already taken the Volume 1 class, take the Volume 2 class. Like I said, both of those are still very early days because we technically started a few months ago, but there's just been a series of travel and sort of personal complications I talked about on Monday that have gotten in the way. And, the Volume 1 class is intentionally slow anyway. The idea is we're really going to take our time with it and only read one section a week. Like I said, at most one section a week. Sometimes, long section will devote multiple weeks, like really, like not be in a hurry with this, right? Really, really savor it. So yeah, the Volume 1 class, like literally on Saturday, we're finishing section 3.2. Because again, we just had to be off for so long. And so that's Volume 1 class. Then the Volume 2 class, we're finally reading chapter 3 on Sunday. We spent a long time going through the introductions and prefaces and stuff also for Volume 2 to kind of set it up because it's so much more dry and technical, right? That, this thing is Volume 1 is like a great work of literature. Volume 2 has flashes of that, right? And it's like definitely interesting. It's definitely worth reading if you're somebody who's gone through Volume 1, but it's Volume 1 is like a sort of unique object, right? It's like it's its own unique thing. But in any case, do by all means sign up for those classes. If you sign up now, again, you haven't even missed that many sessions yet, and all of the old sessions are like the recordings are available forever as long as you're signed up for the class. So you could very easily still catch up to either of those at this point. Patreon.com/Ben Burgess. I can go sign up for those. And also just, if you want to just sign up as a regular GTA patron, support the show, keep it going. Much appreciated. Let's see. GTA producer emeritus and good friend of mine, Cale Brooks, says, Ben, you dunce, you fool. Don't you know that a cook shop and an eatery are ontologically a world apart? Let's see. Yeah, fair enough. All right. Well, having gotten all that off my chest about, why I am such a crank about the Princeton edition of Capital, I am going to go off air now so I can get ready to go and drive to LA and have lunch with my brother and run some errands and get ready to teach tonight's in-person Capital class. Like I said, if anyone watching this is in LA and wants to join tonight, we are doing 2 chapters, but they're both super short, digestible chapters. Chapter 21 on peace wages and chapter 22 on national differences in wages. And that class meets again, so Wednesday night, so tonight, at 7 p.m. at Cafe Mach in Koreatown in Los Angeles. Like I said, that one's free. You can just show up. I get enough pleasure out of doing this in person, and like getting to spend my Wednesday nights on surplus value talk, followed by late night Korean food runs. That I'm extremely happy to just do that. But yeah, if you do want to do it, either tonight or next Wednesday would be your last chances for a minute, not for that long, but just because we're doing chapters 21 and 22 tonight, chapter 23 next Wednesday, and then the 2 Wednesdays after that are off because the next 2 Wednesdays, like I said, are Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve. But yeah, if you want to come hear about peace wages, national differences in wages, tonight in Koreatown, should be a good time. We'll be talking about that. We will most fucking definitely be using the Penguin edition, except no substitutes. No show tomorrow because crashing with a friend while I'm in LA, and not gonna impose doing a GTA episode on him. It's a one room deal, right? Sort of two, but even so, right? In any case, on Friday we will be turning back from talking about this lovely, brilliant 19th century analysis of high level theoretical issues about the kind of society we still live in today, but like very much in a view of 10,000 feet, to the awful, sordid day-to-day realities of politics in the United States of America in 2025. We're going to be talking about one Nicholas Fuentes and why it seems to be so hard to exile him into whatever moldy corner of the discourse he very richly deserves to be sent back to. So that is going to be this Friday, same time slot. So that's 11:30 a.m. East Coast, 8:30 a.m. West Coast. I will see you guys then. Left is best.